The Pacific is vast, a 70 million square mile graveyard for secrets. But on this day, 400 miles from the Galapagos Islands, one secret was visible. At 1300 hours local time, the US military was watching a submarine that had no idea it was already caught. In less than 4 hours, this low-profile vessel, this floating piece of criminal engineering, would slip into the global shipping lanes. Once among 1,000 legitimate contacts, it would vanish. But the crew of the circling HC-130J surveillance plane didn't know the most critical detail yet. This sophisticated Narco Sub had one brutal surprise waiting for them. A trick that would turn a routine interdiction into a three-way knife fight standoff on the open ocean. The radar operator stared at his screen, hunting a contact that was barely there. 3 brief sweeps of visibility, then 9 sweeps of absolute nothing. It was like a light switch being flicked on and off in a dark room. This target gave back almost nothing, just occasional flickers of a fiberglass hull when the swell briefly exposed an outboard motor. But one number told the whole story. 8 knots. Nobody legitimate moves that slow, that far from land. 8 knots was the lazy, confident pace of 3 tons of illegal cargo, riding so low that every swell washed over the deck. The bearing matched the pipeline, Colombia to Mexico. The product changes hands, and the street price triples. There were no fishing fleets here, no container ships. No reason to be here except the obvious one. The tactical coordinator switched to thermal imaging. The ghost track became solid. These LPVs are designed with only 18 inches of hull above the water, painted ocean gray. They're invisible beyond 500 meters to the naked eye, but they are deafeningly loud to the technology staring down from 5,000 feet. But one number told the whole story. 8 knots. Nobody legitimate moves that slow, that far from land. 8 knots was the lazy, confident pace of 3 tons of illegal cargo, riding so low that every swell washed over the deck. The bearing matched the pipeline, Colombia to Mexico. The product changes hands, and the street price triples. There were no fishing fleets here, no container ships. No reason to be here except the obvious one. The tactical coordinator switched to thermal imaging. The ghost track became solid. These LPVs are designed with only 18 inches of hull above the water, painted ocean gray. They're invisible beyond 500 meters to the naked eye, but they are deafeningly loud to the technology staring down from 5,000 feet. Spotting it was the easy part. The nightmare was what came next, actually getting to it. The problem was simple, unforgiving mathematics. The closest Coast Guard cutter, the Seneca, could make 20 knots if her old turbines didn't complain. She was 50 miles away. That's 2.5 hours to intercept at flank speed. The smugglers would reach the congested, untraceable waters in 4 hours. This was the kind of math that meant mission failure unless you had something that flew instead of sailed. The Seneca's flight deck dissolved into controlled chaos. The MH-65 helicopter crew got their scramble order. Pre-flight checks were cut in half. Weapons were loaded while rotors were still tied down. Fuel calculations were scribbled on kneeboards already damp with sea spray. The intercept point was 150 miles out, an hour's flight just to get there. The MH-65 carried enough fuel for 3.5 hours, but combat maneuvering doesn't sip fuel, it guzzles it. They had to stop the sub, babysit it for 3 hours until Seneca arrived, and then still have enough fuel to cover the boarding. The fuel computer kept spitting out the same answer: land with fumes in a tank and a prayer on your lips. The gunner checked the N240 mount. Yesterday, the Traverse motor had seized solid salt corrosion in the bearings. They'd freed it with penetrating oil and crossed their fingers. Salt is patient. It eats everything on a ship eventually, but it has a distinct preference for consuming critical systems during operations. The helicopter lifted off and banked toward a rendezvous that would happen with margins measured in gallons, not miles. The pilot watched his gauge like a gambler, watching his last chips. Every minute at high power was 2 minutes less endurance. Meanwhile, Seneca charged through the Pacific swells, her captain understanding the deadly trade-off. She had to arrive before the smugglers could open one valve and scuttle all the evidence. The MH-65 arrived overhead at 14:15, dropping from a clear sky toward the Narco Sub. The pilot brought them down to 200 feet, and the rotor wash hit the ocean like an invisible, percussive hammer. The water beneath them became a mess of spray and foam, sending waves radiating outward, making the LPV rock on swells it was never built for. The gunner reached for the M240's controls. Time for the warning shot sequence. He pushed the Traverse motor. Nothing. He tried again. Locked solid. Salt had crystallized in the bearings, creating 40 pounds of resistance in a system designed for 2. They had a machine gun that couldn't aim. and 2 hours to hold position with it. The pilot made the adjustment without a word. He brought the helicopter into a sliding hover, flying sideways at 50 knots, tilting the entire $15 million aircraft just to line up the frozen barrel. It's a maneuver you won't find in any flight manual. They don't always fly by the book, they fly by what works. The fuel flow jumped immediately 95 gallons an hour instead of 76. But they needed those warning shots more than they needed perfect economy. The first burst hit the water 100 meters ahead of the Narco Sub. The smugglers didn't react. 8 knots maintained. They probably thought the awkward, sideways approach was a sign of equipment failure. They were half right. The equipment had failed. The crew hadn't. The pilot brought them around for another pass, holding the impossible angle while the gunner tried to muscle the mount free through sheer will. Salt is patient and steel is stubborn. Coast Guard gunners are both. Second burst, 50 meters from the bow. Still no response. Third pass, 10 meters. The rounds hit close enough that the smugglers could probably feel the pressure wave through the hull. That did it. All outboards shut down at once. A sudden, heavy silence followed the constant drone. The Narco Sub went from barely moving to completely dead, drifting in the swells while the 3 men below contemplated every poor life choice they'd made. The helicopter settled into an orbit at 200 feet, the frozen gun still pointing sideways like a broken weather vane. Step 1 was complete. Step 2 was keeping it stopped. 12 minutes into the holding pattern, the radar screen lit up with a new problem. 2 contacts were approaching fast from the southwest, moving at 40 knots. At that speed, they would arrive in 12 minutes. The pilot kept his orbit over the Narco Sub, but his attention was split between what he was guarding and what was coming. Protection boats. They are standard cartel procedure. They run 10 to 15 minutes behind their submarines, close enough to help, far enough to deny involvement. These weren't rescue vessels. They were insurance policies with attitude and high-performance outboards. The boats closed to 4 miles and started their own wide circle, maintaining 2,000 meters just outside effective small arms range, but close enough to matter. The pilot could see them. Go-fast boats with multiple people on deck. They were probing, testing, trying to figure out what the helicopter would do if pushed. One boat darted toward the Narco Sub, closing to 1,500 meters before the pilot swung the nose toward it. Even with a broken gun mount, a military helicopter pointing at you means something. The boat veered off, but its partner immediately moved in from the opposite side. Pack tactics, trying to split the helicopter's attention. The gunner was still fighting the M240 mount, trying to break it free through pure, desperate determination. Every time a boat approached, he'd wrestle the gun, managing maybe 10 degrees of movement before the crystallized salt won the battle again. The protection boats probably had their own weapons. AK-47s were standard. At this range, accuracy was questionable, but a lucky shot is still a shot you don't want to take. For 15 minutes, this deadly dance continued. Boats approaching, boats retreating. The helicopter pivoting to track. The Narco Sub crew watching their backup probe American responses. The pilot was burning fuel at combat settings, watching his gauge drop while the Seneca was still over 90 minutes out. They were waiting out the helicopter's fuel state, trying to force it to leave for the ship or risk swimming home. They made one more aggressive pass, both closing to 800 meters simultaneously from opposite directions. The pilot had to choose which boat to face. He chose neither. Instead, he climbed to 500 feet to show he could engage both if needed. The message was clear. Broken gun or not, outnumbered or not, this helicopter was not leaving the target. The protection boats got it. They turned southwest and opened throttles, racing toward international waters at 45 knots. They hadn't rescued anyone, but they'd managed to force the helo to burn through fuel it didn't have. The Seneca finally arrived on scene, her gray hull a steel wall between the Narco Sub and any chance of escape. She slowed to 5 knots while the deck crew prepped the RIB for launch. The seas were building, 6-foot swells with 8-footers rolling in. The barometer was dropping fast. In an hour, launching would be impossible. The davit, the ship's crane, swung the 7-meter rigid hull inflatable boat, or RIB, over the water. 8,600 pounds of boat and operators hung from a steel cable. The static rating meant nothing in moving seas. Every wave that passed under the hull multiplied the load, compression on the way up, tension on the way down. The crane operator watched the wave pattern, counting seconds between crests. The moment came. Between sets, the ocean flattened for maybe 4 seconds. The operator hit the release. The RIB dropped 6 feet and hit the water, engines already running. The coxswain driving the RIB punched the throttles before the next wave arrived. shooting away from the Seneca's hull. Getting crushed between 4,500 tons of steel and a breaking wave was nobody's idea of a good time. The helicopter maintained its orbit at 200 feet. Fuel now down to 134 gallons. The pilot had done the math, witnessed the boarding, provide cover, then land before the helicopter transformed into a submarine. The frozen gun didn't matter anymore. The RIB approaching at 45 knots with 6 rifles on board was all the firepower this moment needed. The coxswain brought the RIB alongside the Narco Sub using the specialized maritime technique called the controlled collision. At 45 knots, he aimed for the midship, then at the last second, reversed and pivoted hard, spinning the boat 90 degrees while killing the forward speed. The rib slammed sideways into the Narco Sub, the inflatable collar absorbing the impact, grinding against the fiberglass hull as both vessels rose and fell on different wave cycles. The first operator jumped when the boats briefly matched height, a terrifying 2-second window that wouldn't repeat for another 8. He landed hard on the wet fiberglass, 40 pounds of gear and body armor, making it impossible to keep his balance. But his weapon was already up, sweeping for threats while his legs found their footing. One by one, the officers dragged the smugglers out of the hatch until all 3 were secured. Another officer searched the vessel, ensuring no one else was hiding, down below to scuttle the sub. The cargo was secured. The RIB and the helicopter were safely recovered by the Seneca. The criminal groups were already working on their next sub before the sun rose. But the lesson learned that day was a brutal one. On the high seas, the Coast Guard's commitment is absolute. Regardless of the odds, the conditions, or the failure of their gear, they fly by what works, and they do not back down. If you like deep dive in military, please don't forget like, comment, share, and subscribe for more informative videos. Thanks for watching.